In this extended lesson, we'll take a look at creating a line and wash image with pen and ink and watercolor. Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this extended lesson we're going to take a look at combining pen and ink applications with watercolor washes to create a wonderful landscape using the process of line and wash. Now this video is broken down into two parts. In part one, we're going to create the drawing using a light graphite sketch, and then over the top we're going to apply pen and ink applications. Then in part two, we're going to apply watercolor washes. You won't notice a clear difference between part one and part two, but this process is subsected down into two parts. Part one, the drawing part, part two, the painting part. Now, if you're brand new to this channel, I'd like to encourage you to subscribe to the channel. I create videos on a variety of drawing and painting media and a variety of different subjects. We cover basically everything that's art related, so hit that subscribe button. Now, let's go ahead and get into the process. Here's a look at the photo reference we're going to be working from, and this photo reference is from a wonderful site called pixabay.com. Now what we're going to do here in the early stages is we're going to use a light graphite pencil, like a 2H pencil, which is the pencil that I'm going to be using, and we're just going to break this object down into the most basic shapes that we can see. We're going to sketch them very, very lightly and very, very loosely with our 2H pencil. So we're basically going to be constructing the form of our subject in our composition. This includes the basic shapes that we see, and most of the shapes are geometric on the boat itself, but we'll also designate the areas where we see the edge of the distant mountain, the horizon line, the areas of the water, and the bank here in the foreground. The materials we'll use for this drawing are a 2H graphite pencil, a kneaded eraser, Staedtler pigment liner pens. We'll be working on hot press 140-pound watercolor paper. So we'll start very loosely with our 2H graphite pencil on the hot press watercolor paper. Again, just lightly sketching out the basic shapes and forms that we see on our subject. Remember to keep your drawing nice and light in these early stages. And I realize it's a little difficult to see here on the video, but it's important to keep your drawing extra light. You also want to make sure that you don't put too much pressure on the pencil to create indentations or grooves in the surface of the paper. Although this wouldn't be too big of a deal since we're using watercolor to apply the color, it's always good practice to keep that in the back of your mind. Now, we're not going to concern ourselves too much with all of the intricate details. We will add the windows and the openings and the railings that we see on the boat, but we're not going to get too consumed with drawing all of the small, minute details, since a lot of these details will be developed with our pen and ink applications. It's a good idea to keep your hand moving and move your whole arm when you're sketching things out. Again, since we're using light marks here and loose marks, we don't have to be too precise with any of the details that we do decide to add. Once we're a little bit more confident with our initial sketch, we can place a little bit more pressure on the pencil to highlight some of those important areas and edges of different details. Now our graphite drawing is in place and we're ready to start making pen and ink applications. And for this entire pen and ink drawing, I'll be using the Staedtler Pigment Liner 0.05mm pen. You're welcome to use nib or dib pens or a brand of your choosing. Now, honestly, we can really start anywhere we prefer in this particular drawing, but in this case, I'll start with the windows on the boat. We'll start by just drawing out the contour lines or reinforcing the outlines. And although we're using pen and ink, a lot of people think that you have to be really stiff with pen and ink applications. A lot of times people are afraid they're going to make a mistake, but you can see here, we can still be relatively loose with our marks. It'll give our drawing a bit of character. Now, as we work, we'll start filling in some of the areas of shadow, and you'll see here that I'm using mostly consistent lines to do so. I'll use mostly hatching in the areas of shadow and shy away from using too many areas of cross hatching. But as we work, we can also add little details of texture. As you can see here, I'm adding a bit of texture to the top portion of the boat, just using some squiggly lines. We'll continue working our way to the left side of the boat. We're basically just working out from the area we began. And as we do so, we'll continue to develop some of the areas of shadow. Now, of course, since we're going to be applying watercolor applications over the top, we want to be careful that we don't get too carried away with developing our areas of shadow. If you make the areas too dark, it can make the final result appear too dark in areas and overall a little too contrasting. So we're going to be careful in the areas of shadow and make sure that we don't make those values too dark. Then we'll simply move onward and outward from where we began, developing textures as we go, defining the outlines and the contour lines. You'll notice that in some areas I decided to use a broken line, as we can see here on the edge of the boat, and that's simply because our light source is originating from the upper right-hand portion of the scene. Although this is an overcast day, we still need to consider the light source, and it's not a very strong light source, but we still see areas of shadow and we still see areas of highlight. As you can see here, I'm pulling out certain details that I want to include in the drawing. And one of those details, of course, is the text and lettering. So we'll slow down at this point. And even though I have created a graphite sketch underneath, I'm following more the upper line right above it on the top edge of the boat to make sure that this text lines up with that particular edge. And we're making sure to add those little serifs as well. That, of course, will make the text look more like it's actually painted text and instead of just drawn with a thin pen. Now we'll add a few of the details on the boat, and in this case we're going to add some of the slats, and we're just going to use a light broken line for this. And we'll also add some of the areas where the boat is falling apart, some of the broken edges and things like that, some of the openings, and we can just use little scribble marks to create a little bit of shadow in these areas to give the illusion that it is recessed and that these are actually openings. But we'll stay consistent for the larger areas, again using hatching here. And you'll notice that the diagonal of the hatch that we create here is consistent across those open areas. But as we work down towards the bottom portion of the boat, we can see that we've changed the direction of the line quite a bit. We can use line to create contrast as well, and also create the illusion of form. So by allowing these lines to bend slightly, we create the illusion that the bottom portion of the boat is slightly curved, while at the same time developing the areas of darker value and of course the texture as well. Here again, the values are nice and dark in this location, but we want to make sure we don't get too dark because we're going to be creating darker values with the watercolor applications as well. We'll go ahead and fill in all of those areas of deep shadow where the boat is falling apart. We can see the inside parts of it. We'll leave a couple of areas of lighter value in between though, so that we can see those broken bits. Then we'll move on to the grassy area just underneath, and again you can see how loose these marks are. Again, I can't reiterate the point too much. You need to just stay loose with your pen and ink applications as well. If you're too stiff with your mark making, it'll show in your drawing, and your overall drawing will be fairly stiff as well. We'll simply continue working our way to the back portion of the boat, again repeating this process, developing the contour lines and then adding the textures and the values. Now with the majority of the boat in place, we're ready to start thinking about the areas around the boat. We'll start with the bank here. And again, as we continue with this process of the pen and ink drawing, we have to keep in mind that we're not creating just a pen and ink drawing. We're creating an underlayment in which to apply the watercolor applications. So here again, we want to make sure that we don't get too dark with our values, since a lot of the darker values are going to be developed with our watercolor applications. With pen and ink and watercolor, we have to find a balance between our pen and ink applications and the watercolor washes. We have to think about this while we're applying the pen and ink. Here you can see we're making loose marks here just to give some indication of some of the grass that's growing on the bank here. And as we work our way down the bank, we'll create some darker values here, but again, try to keep our lines as consistent as possible. You'll notice that the direction of the stroke does change according to the form of the bank. This helps us to communicate the form of the bank while we develop the textures and the values. We'll also add a small little twig that's coming out of the bank here with just some simple lines. Again, we're just going to pull these lines out from the bank and allow them to taper as they extend outward. This is a great way to draw tree branches. Then we'll simply continue the process of adding ink as we work our way down the bank. You can see here as I'm pulling out the line, I'm trying to add quite a bit of character to the line. As much character as you can include in your drawing or paintings, the better. You can see I'm using a little bit of some squiggly lines here and there and just trying to capture the texture without getting too overworked with making everything perfect. And that's one thing that you might have to let go of if you're going to be an artist, and that is perfection. Perfection just simply will not exist and does not exist in any drawing or painting that you create. So allow your hand to be seen in the artwork. And what I mean by that is allow your marks to be uniquely yours. And if your mark is a little scribbly and loose, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We'll now fill in some of the darker values here along the bottom of the bank and add a few rocks here and there. And of course, pull up some of the grassy marks that happen on the left side of the picture plane. Now, as we add these grassy marks, I'm going to try to incorporate a little bit of movement here. Now, movement is one of the principles of art, and sometimes movement can refer to the way a viewer's eye might move through the piece, or it might refer to actual physical movement if you have someone running, for example. But in this case, I'm going to try to create a sense of movement of the actual grass blowing in the breeze. So for the most part, we're going to try to allow our marks to curve predominantly to the left. Now, of course, we're going to have some of the marks that go to the right too, to add a bit of variety, but you can see here that for the most part, most of the strokes that I'm making here, I'm going to have them go upward and curve to the left. Now, to create the illusion that we have lots of different grass blades here, we're going to change the directional stroke. So you can see here I'm planning out some of the larger grass blades and then going in with some hatching in between, creating some of those shadowed areas, but also because of the stroke, we're creating the illusion that there's additional grass blades in between the more dominant ones. And as we work our way down, we'll add a little bit of cast shadow there, again using hatching, and again making the directional strokes that we make mimic that of the form of the bank. Now, just behind these taller grass blades, we have an area where the grass is a little bit darker, so we'll fill that in with some hatching. And then we're ready to address the horizon line, or the area where the distant hill meets the water. So we'll use a broken line for this and allow it to extend all the way across the picture plane. Then we'll add just a few details on that distant shoreline, a few trees popping up here and there with just a little bit of cast shadow there, again using hatching to indicate this. We'll define the contour line of the distant mountain, and then again just a hint of some of the details off there in the distance. Now we'll address the foreground, and this bank here in the foreground just basically helps to frame the composition. So a few indications of texture here and just a few areas of darker value. Then we'll add a few marks for the water. Of course, we've already added a little bit of shadow underneath the boat where we have a little bit of a reflection / shadow in this area. Now you can see here the directional strokes that I'm making here are rather loose, but they're also predominantly horizontal. This is the contrast that I alluded to earlier. Just by changing the direction of the stroke, we can create contrast, and contrast doesn't always have to refer to value contrast or color contrast. It's anything that deals with difference. So changing the direction of the stroke, of course, creates some difference and lets our viewer know that this surface area is different from the surface area that we see on the bank. We'll go back in and make that value slightly darker, then allow our ink to dry completely and erase our remaining pencil lines. Now our pen and ink drawing is complete and we're ready for watercolor applications. Now that we're ready to apply color, we need to think about the colors that we're going to use. Of course, we could always just match the colors, and in this particular painting, matching the colors is not a bad idea. In fact, we're going to be doing a lot of color matching in this particular painting. But we can also highlight and pull out some of the colors that we see and accentuate them to make our painting a little bit more interesting. So if we look closely at this painting, we can find some specific colors that stand out as being dominant. The most dominant color that I see in this particular image is a red-orange. It's somewhere in between red and red-orange on the color wheel. We see this color on the boat itself, of course, where it's rusting and falling apart. I believe that's rust. And some of the areas on the bank. So it makes sense to incorporate this color in our color scheme. Then we can look for other colors that we can pull out. In this particular case, there's a lot of greens in this scene as well. Now, green is not directly across from orange on the color wheel. It's close, but not quite. Of course, red is the complement of green. But if we push the greens that we see a little bit closer to blue-green, and we push the oranges that we see a little bit closer to red-orange, then we can find ourselves in a situation where we're getting very close to a complementary color scheme. Now, it's not exact, of course, but these colors are close to being directly across from each other on the color wheel, so it will provide a high level of contrast and, of course, create some pop in our image. Of course, there are a lot of other colors in the scene as well. There are yellow oranges, and of course, there are some blues as well, and we won't shy away from using those in our image, but our dominant two sets of colors will be the blue-greens and the red-oranges. For our watercolor applications, I'll be using my filled watercolor set with Cotman watercolors by Winsor & Newton. You're free to use any brand that you wish. We'll only be using a few pigments. And for the brushes, I'll be using Grumbacher Golden Edge nylon brushes. I'll be using 2 round brushes, a number 14 and a number 4. We'll start by addressing our sky, so we'll use a little bit of cobalt blue and we'll add just a touch of burnt umber into that mixture just to tone it down a little bit, mute the color quite a bit. We want our sky to be somewhat of a bluish gray, so by mixing these two pigments together it'll give us a bluish gray. Just be careful that you don't add too much burnt umber to the mixture to make it a warmer gray or even a brown. We'll start at the top with a light and loose and watery application. Of course, we want this application to be very translucent. We'll allow a couple of open spaces to indicate a few of the clouds, but we want our sky to be very, very light and very airy. We'll add additional applications of the cobalt blue down towards the bottom just to give it more of a cooler appearance. And of course, we're applying all of this color while the surface is wet, and that's going to encourage some bleeding, so the color is going to move around quite a bit and give us that nice watercolor look. Now, to speed up the drying process, we can use a hair dryer and dry up the applications that we've made in the sky. And then we'll move on to addressing the middle ground and the foreground. We're going to start here with just a simple application of yellow ochre. We're also going to pull in just a touch of burnt sienna just to give it a little bit more of a reddish feel. We'll start right at the top of the distant mountain, right where the mountain meets the sky, and with a very light and watery application, we'll apply this color. And as the bead of water stays active, we'll play around with it a little bit and move it on the surface. And we're just going to take this color and pull it down from the top of the mountain all the way down into the main portion of the image. As we work our way across the area of water, we'll leave a couple of open spaces to start to begin to create that indication that we have some reflection in the water. By creating a light wash like this over the entire middle ground, we help to ensure that we are creating some harmony and unity in the painting. So by using the same color in multiple parts throughout your image, you can help to ensure that you create harmony and unity in your own paintings. We'll also even add this color to portions of the water here in the foreground, again using mostly horizontal stroking here and leaving some open areas for some strong highlights in the water. Now we're ready to address some of the greens, and we'll keep with a very light wash here. We'll grab a bit of sap green. We'll also allow that to mix in a little bit with our blue-gray that we created for the sky, just to mute it down a little bit. We'll pull in some burnt umber and also some yellow ochre. This will create a more natural-looking green, a more earthy-looking green. And then we'll start in the distant landmass and start applying this color over the top of our dried applications that we just applied with the yellow ochre. This will allow some of the yellow ochre to show through the mixture and create a more natural appearance. We'll add this mixed green in a couple of areas in the foreground and the middle ground as well. And of course, we're going to allow these applications to be very, very light and translucent. With watercolor painting, remember we're starting with lighter applications, and as we progress through the painting, we'll gradually get darker with our values. This is almost the direct opposite when we use an opaque painting medium like oils or acrylics, where we typically start with the darker values and then progressively add the lighter values. So with watercolor, we work from light to dark, and with opaque painting mediums, we work from dark to light. Now we'll mix in a bit of burnt sienna with our yellow ochre, and we'll start to add some variations of our color to some of the foreground. We'll add this color to some of the bits of smaller grassy areas where we see more of that red-orange. And speaking of red-orange, you'll remember that when we discussed the colors that we're going to pull out, we're going to kind of push the oranges more towards that red-orange side of the color wheel. So we'll pick up a little bit of cadmium red pale hue and add it while the area is still wet. This will allow this color to bleed around and allow for some transitions between stronger reds and some areas that are a little bit more orange. We'll also pull this color down along the bank as we start to develop some of the darker values. Now, you might be wondering why I say darker values since the washes are still light. Again, we're just going to progressively build up our applications and gradually get darker and darker. We'll also allow some of these applications to overlap the greens, and this is going to create a more natural look, believe it or not. We'll apply this color to the foreground, and we'll equally disperse it throughout the composition. Again, this will encourage more harmony and unity. We'll go back to our sap green and make some of the colors in the green areas a little bit more intense. You can see here I'm still working with the larger brush, and I'm going to work with the larger number 14 size brush as long as I possibly can. This is going to keep me loose, and when we're adding watercolor applications, a lot of times we want to stay relatively loose. Pen and ink and watercolor work so well together because pen and ink is so defined and so rigid, while watercolor is loose and fluid. Now we'll grab a little bit of burnt umber and a bit of cobalt blue to create a more natural looking black. In this case, we're going to allow this warmer color that we created to be a little bit more dominated by the burnt umber and the yellow ochre that we already had on the palette. Then we'll start filling in some of the shadowed areas and the grassy areas that are closest to the viewer. Each time we go back to the palette, we might pick up a little bit of a variation of the color that we've mixed. In this case, we might pick up a little bit more yellow ochre or even cobalt blue. And not only is this acceptable, but it's encouraged. It'll create a more natural appearance in your painting. We'll progressively get darker and more intense with our applications. Here we're applying some of this color to the shadowed areas along the bank. You can see we're still allowing some of our initial washes to show through. Those colors are important as well. We'll pull some of these stronger red oranges over to the bank that's closest to the viewer here in the foreground. Again, using loose marks. But you'll notice that these marks also flow over the form of this area as well. Instead of making vertical strokes here, our strokes are more horizontal. Now we'll go in with a bit of sap green and yellow ochre and make some of the grassy areas underneath the boat a little bit more intense. While the water is still wet on the surface, we can move it around and pull this color into other areas, allowing it to bleed with some of the other mixtures that we already have in place. We'll also apply this color to some of the grassy areas that are closest to the viewer. Now with a slightly darker version of our sap green and yellow ochre, we'll make some of the shadows on the distant landmass a little bit darker. We're making these applications mostly in the areas of shadow. And if they're a little bit too dark, we can simply dab them with a paper towel and lift up some of the color. As we work loosely with the watercolor applications and allow some of our colors to mix together, keep in mind that we don't have to spell everything out for our viewer. As long as we have value relationships that make sense and values and colors in the correct location, our viewers will make sense of the scene on their own. Now we'll grab a bit of cobalt blue and a bit of burnt umber to create again a more natural looking shadow color. And we'll pull in a little bit of our yellow ochre mixture and create some of the shadow that exists underneath the boat on the water. Now this area is very rich with yellow-orange, but we're still going to start with a light application. By layering our applications in this way, we add to the complexity of the color that we create, and our colors have more depth. Here again, since we're working in an area of water, we'll use mostly horizontal strokes. And we'll still leave a couple of open areas to indicate some reflections and highlights. We can go back over with this slightly darker mixture and create some depth in the area of the water on the right side of the picture plane. Now we'll strengthen up the shadow underneath the boat on the bank using a mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber. As you can see here, this mixture is dominated by the burnt umber to give it a warmer appearance. We'll pull some of this color down into the shadow or reflected area in the water as well. And we'll also pull some of this darker value down the bank a little ways as well. Now let's bring in a little bit more of that yellow-orange that happens here. So we'll return to the palette and grab a little bit more of the yellow ochre with just a touch of burnt sienna, and pull that color over the entire area that we've designated in the water for this yellow-orange. Then it's back to our mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber to make the shadows even darker. We'll pull the same mixture right up into the areas of grass, making the shadows stronger here as well. And then we'll do the same thing to the grassy area that's closest to the viewer on the left side of the picture plane. We're not covering the entire area of shadow, we're just adding this color in selected areas to make the shadows a little stronger and to increase the contrast. We'll also do the same in the area of grass that's slightly darker behind the taller grass blades. We'll also strengthen the shadow all along the side of the bank, including the area on the right side of the picture plane. And we'll give a slight indication of shadow on the bank that's closest to the viewer in the foreground. We can use this color throughout the painting to strengthen up the shadows, making it more intense with less water and less intense with more water. Now you might be wondering why we're not using black for this, and that's simply because black is such a strong color. It's usually a good idea to mix your own black, and by combining the cobalt blue and burnt umber, we create a more natural looking black. And by layering it over the top of areas where we already have color, it just simply makes the value darker and makes a more natural appearance. Now let's bring a little bit more warmth to the sea, so we'll go over the bank with a little bit more yellow ochre. You can see how the colors underneath just show through. We'll also do the same with our greens, making them slightly more intense. Now we're ready to turn our attention to the real star of the show, which is the boat, of course. You may have been wondering why I saved this for the last instead of the beginning part of the painting. And the reason for this is because I want to make sure that some of the colors that I've incorporated in the background, the foreground, and the middle ground, or the areas around the boat, are also echoed in the boat itself. This again will help to create some more harmony and unity in the painting. So we'll start here with a light wash of burnt umber with just a touch of cadmium yellow pale hue mixed in. And then we can make those values slightly darker by adding a bit more of our burnt umber and cobalt blue mixture. This is a very light application here on the top portion of the boat. You'll notice that as these directional strokes are made with the paintbrush, they're in the same direction as the strokes we made with the pen and ink earlier in the process. This is because directional stroking, although maybe not completely evident with our watercolor washes, does play a role in creating the illusion of form. So as we work our way to the body of the boat, or the bow of the boat, we'll change the directional strokes that we make here, adding just a bit of cobalt blue and burnt umber. You can see here in this case, the cobalt blue is dominating the mixture, creating more of a bluish gray. It may not seem like these underlayment applications are very important, but they'll show through in our final painting, again adding complexity to the color. Down here on the lower portion of the boat, we'll add a little bit more of a concentrated application of this mixture. Now we'll start pushing the value range, just as we've done throughout the painting to this point. Again, making values slightly darker. But we won't try to tackle this all in one swoop. We'll do it gradually with a layered process. We'll work in different areas on the boat as different areas begin to dry. Now we're ready to pull out some of those red oranges on the boat where the boat is really decayed and falling apart. We'll start here with burnt sienna, and while the surface is still wet, we'll just dab the surface with a larger brush, allowing the paint to flow and move around and blend with the other colors that are already in place. The color is going to be more intense when we first apply it, but as it dries, it fades and becomes less intense, so don't let these applications scare you. We'll go ahead and apply this color to the entire side of the boat in selected areas. Then we'll pull out a bit more red by pulling in a bit more cadmium red pale hue along with our burnt sienna. And since our surface is still wet, again we can just simply dab the surface and allow these brilliant reds to bleed around. Although we'll put this color in a couple of different areas towards the rear of the boat, we'll allow this area closer to the front of the boat to be the area that's most intense. This area will serve as our focal point within a focal point. So of course our boat is the focal point, but on the boat we're naturally drawn to the text in these areas of strong, intense red oranges. Now we're ready to pull out some of those greens and that color relationship between the blue greens and the red oranges. We'll start with a bit of viridian, and then we'll add just a bit of sap green to make it appear a little bit more natural. Then we'll start applying it directly in the areas where we just applied the red orange. Of course, this isn't going to encourage a lot of bleeding, which is what we're after. Some of this blue-green will bleed into the areas of red-orange and create natural transitions. Down on the lower portion of the boat where we have the area of darker value, we'll really accentuate the blue-greens here. Of course, this blue-green is a little bit different from the greens that we have in the surrounding areas, but it makes sense for the painting and it makes sense for the decaying areas on the boat. And since we've added a bit of sap green, it harmonizes to a certain degree. Now we need to intensify some of these colors, of course, so another application of burnt sienna with a touch of cadmium red is applied. You can see there's a lot of water on the surface, and this is what I'm after. I want these colors to really bleed and transition into each other rather gradually. Now we'll switch over to our smaller brush, finally, and start developing some of the details a little bit further. We'll start by developing some of the shadowed areas on the top portion of the boat. This is a mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber, the same mixture we mixed before, but a little bit more water is added to make a more natural looking gray. We'll add a bit of color here with a touch of burnt sienna. And then we'll accentuate some of the texture details, again with a smaller brush with a mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber. With a smaller brush, we can make the shadows within the windows a lot stronger. We don't want to make them completely black, of course, so we'll still be able to see some of the pen and ink applications underneath. We'll also strengthen up the shadows on the railings and add a bit of color to some of the other elements. In this case, the color we're adding is still our mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber. This time it's just more dominated with the cobalt blue to create a cooler gray. We'll continue simply making our shadows a little bit darker, of course increasing the contrast and the value range in the painting. And we can also add hints of texture here and there as well. Now we'll add a bit of color to the front edge of the boat. We'll do this with a light application of yellow ochre. We'll also pull this color into the body of the boat to harmonize it. You can see how complex our colors are becoming with these layered applications. We'll also apply a bit of yellow ochre to the top portion of the boat as well, allowing some of our blue-grays to show underneath. And then again, we'll pull out some more of our red-oranges with an application of burnt sienna, this time with a little bit more control. We'll also add a few linear marks here. Then a bit more with our blue-green. Again, this is just viridian with a bit of sap green mixed in. We'll add a few hints of this color here and there. Now we'll make our shadowed areas quite a bit darker. Again, we'll use our mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber. This creates a more natural black, if you'll remember. Not only that, but it also gives us the advantage of pushing our black to a warmer black or a cooler black. If we use more cobalt blue in our mixture, we'll create a cooler black. As we see here, if we use a little bit more burnt umber, we'll create a warmer black. So not only does mixing our own black give us a more natural black, but it also gives us control over the color temperature. Using the same mixture, we'll start to strengthen up some of the shadows on the bottom portion of the boat. We'll make the shadows on the lower portion of the boat fairly dark, pulling strokes in the same direction that we did with our pen and ink applications. Now we'll intensify the colors on the front edge of the boat and on the body of the boat with an additional application of yellow ochre with a bit of burnt sienna. We'll use a bit of our blue-green mixture of viridian and sap green on the little small piece at the top of the boat. Again, this is staying with our complementary color scheme that we pointed out earlier. We'll make the shadows on the boat a little bit darker with cobalt blue and burnt umber. And then we'll use our blue-gray mixture that's dominated by cobalt blue to add a few ripples or indications of ripples in the water area behind the boat. Here again you can see we're using horizontal strokes here, leaving open spaces for reflection and highlight. It should be obvious, but we don't have to follow our photo reference exactly. This is true of any drawing or painting that you create, and in this case we're intensifying some of the blues here just to make the painting feel a little bit more representational. We'll do the same thing on the right side of the picture plane, again using our blue-gray mixture. We'll make the shadows just a bit stronger here on the distant trees, again with cobalt blue and burnt umber. And then we'll use our cobalt blue and burnt umber here in the foreground, again just tying in this section of water with the water behind it. Now we'll intensify the shadow under the boat even further. This time we have a little bit more Viridian in our mixture. So we have Viridian, burnt umber, and cobalt blue to create this really dark blue-green. As we develop these darker values, we increase the contrast. And as we increase the contrast in this area of water, it starts to become believable. We'll go ahead and continue to develop some of the darker values and shadows all along the bank, pulling some of these shadows out into the water itself, again using horizontal strokes for the most part. Now we'll intensify the sections of yellow-orange in the water even further. Again, this is a mixture of burnt sienna and yellow ochre. There's a touch of burnt umber in the mixture as well, just to make it a little bit darker. Here again, we'll leave open spaces, allowing the color underneath to show through to indicate some ripples in the water. We'll pull this color all the way up underneath the shadow of the boat and extend it down the little bit of water that we see. We'll also apply it to the lower portion as well. By applying this color, we strengthen the contrast between it and the darker values as well. Then it's back to our mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber, again dominated by the cobalt blue, to make some darker values close to the lower part of the picture plane. Here again, horizontal strokes are used to indicate the movement and the ripples of the water. Now we'll go back and intensify some of the areas of yellow-orange even further on the bank. Here again with a bit of yellow ochre with a touch of burnt sienna. And then we'll strengthen up some of the shadows even further. You can see that throughout this process, we just continue to strengthen the shadows. And as we do, we broaden the range of value and increase the contrast. Now, we've left out one important element, so we'll add it now, and that's the cast shadow underneath the small twig growing up from the bank of the river. This shadow is added with our mixture of cobalt blue and burnt umber. And now we're ready to pull off the tape and reveal those nice, crisp, strong edges. When you pull tape away from your finished painting, make sure you pull at a 90-degree angle like we see here. This will help keep the tape from tearing the surface of the paper. And once all the tape has been pulled off, it reveals our finished painting. And now our line and wash painting is complete. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you're still here, that means that you are interested in what you saw. And if you're interested in what you saw, then I would encourage you to subscribe to the channel. And I'd also encourage you to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, or just watch another video. Thanks again, and I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.